You may remember the first generation Citroen Cactus. It was all wild shapes and air bumps and it looked pretty funky indeed. Now there's a new one and it's all grown up. Gone is the wild styling of the old and replaced by more subtle new looks. It's also got a new suspension system which Citroen promises to be the most comfortable yet. Can it deliver? Let's find out.
The exterior of the Cactus has been rather radically quietened down. The large side air bumps have been replaced by smaller versions positioned lower down to the side of the car, and the whole thing just feels a little less exciting than before. It's still recognisable as a Citroen, and it's certainly more in line with other cars in the stable such as the C3, but it feels less out there than the first generation Cactus.
Now, Citroen has worked hard to make the new Cactus as comfortable as possible, and as such, it's fitted it with something called progressive hydraulic cushions, and despite sounding a little bit like an 80s rock band, they help to control the up and down movements of the car, therefore flattening out the road ahead, and in truth, it works really well. Now, what the new suspension really does do is deliver a quite silky ride when you're out and about, and this really helps when you're driving at lower speeds because it means that those small imperfections in the road don't translate into the cabin all that much.
Underneath the Cactus's bonnet sits Citroen's 110 PureTech petrol engine, and though there are a variety of other petrol and diesel offerings, this does a great job of propelling the car in a decent fashion. It's not quick, it'll hit 60 miles an hour in just under 9.5 seconds, but it doesn't feel too underpowered out on the road.
What it does mean is that you do have to stir the 5-speed gearbox a little bit more than you would do in a more powerful car, though that really is to be expected. The only thing is that you quite often find yourself in a gear slightly too high for the situation, particularly around town, where you might find in the usual car second gear will be alright. You really do have to drop down into first in the Cactus to make things move along.
A byproduct of that low power and capacity is decent economy. Citroen claims it'll return 65.7 mpg on the combined cycle, while emissions are an impressively low 100 grams per kilometre of CO2.
Now, the Cactus's steering is light, and this makes it really quite useful for driving around town when at lower speeds you really want as much manoeuvrability as possible. It also makes parking really quite a doddle. However, when you're out on the open road, that lack of weight in the steering does mean that you don't have quite as much confidence in where you're placing the car as you would do in a usual vehicle. What it does mean is that when you're coming around a corner, there's not too much precision to the steering, which means you can't accurately place the car. And though this may not be a problem for most people, it means that keener drivers may want to steer clear of the Cactus. Now, one thing I think is really worth pointing out, and particularly so if you're planning on taking your Cactus around town most of all, is that the front end of the car is incredibly hard to see. Because the bonnet is so raked and because it drops so steeply, your corners are really quite far away from you, and this can make it really tricky to position the car at lower speeds.
Now, drivers of the older Citroen Cactus will be pretty familiar with the way the new Cactus's interior looks. The main infotainment system has been updated, but it's really the same sort of system, and all in all the major controls are as they were. However, there are a couple of changes which do make themselves known here in the cabin. The seats, for instance, are newly designed and they're extremely comfortable. They're really soft, however they do lack a little bit of side support, which means that you aren't as hugged in as you might be in usual seats. One weird touch is the starter button, which has been located on the opposite side of the cabin to the driver. Now, it does mean that when you first get in the car, you're left scrabbling trying to find out a way to actually start the engine. And it's a weird touch which we think hasn't been thought out all that well.
When it comes to practicality, the Cactus does reasonably well. Boot space is 358 litres with the rear seats in place, though they can be folded flat in a 60-40 split, extending that space to 1,170 litres. That's more than you'll find in the Nissan Juke, and only just behind what you'll get in a Volkswagen Golf too.
Citroen has delivered a well-rounded, practical and economical small hatchback with its latest Cactus. However, compared to its predecessor, it just seems to have lost a little bit of that sparkle that made it really quite exciting. Compared to rivals, it still really does do rather well, and if you can look past that slight lack in charisma, then you'll be rewarded with a really rather good small car.